I welcome you all for this session. Our topic for this session is Notes and Notations, Writing Music. As panelists, we have in our midst Margaret Barrett, Mr. Robert Davidson, Mr. Graham Welch, Mr. Vikram Sampath, and Ms. Lakshmi Devnath. The moderator for this session is Mr. Anil Srinivasan. Ms. Margaret Barrett is a professor and head of the School of Music at the University of Queensland. She has held positions as editor of research studies in music education, and associate editor of psychology of music, and a member of the editorial boards of key journals in music and arts education. Mr. Robert Davidson is a prolific composer, bassist, lecturer, and founder and artistic director of Topology. With Topology, he has released 11 albums and a DVD and has directed numerous artistic collaborations. Professor Graham Welch holds the Institute of Education, University of London Established Chair of Music Education. He is a past president of the International Society for Music Education, elected chair of the internationally based Society for Education, Music and Psychology Research, and past co-chair of the ISME. Mr. Vikram Sampath is the author of Splendors of Royal Mysore, The Untold Story of the Vodeyars. My Name is Gauhar Jan, The Life and Times of a Musician, and Voice of the Veena, S. Balchandar, a biography. His book on Gauhar Jan won the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar on English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, Southern Regional Center. A trained Carnatic vocalist, he serves on several government committees, the Prasar Bharati Core Group and marketing committees, the Dr. Sam Patroda Commission on National Archives, the Karnataka Knowledge Commission, and the Karnataka Tourism Vision Group. Ms. Lakshmi Devnath is a writer on Carnatic music and other aspects of Indian culture. She has authored Sargam and Purva, Magic Miracles, and Mystical 12. Mr. Anil Srinivasan is a classical pianist who has created a contemporary aesthetic of his own. Winner of the SNA Award for Creative and Experimental Music in 2010, he has performed in some of the most diverse venues in the world, from the UNESCO Heritage Site at Hampi to the Queen Elizabeth Hall at the South Bank Centre. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. And, good afternoon. I know it's a really warm afternoon. Because this is a panel on music, it's going to be a little more unconventional than the usual literature panels. So if I can have a wave just to let me know that you can hear what I'm saying. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Tarakini. That's very, very enthusiastic of you. Thank you, Vikram, for, as usual, organizing such a fantastic festival. This particular panel is called Writing on Music, Notes and Notations. And I have to confess, when all of us have met, we've been trying to discuss whether this is writing on music, or writing within music, or writing off music. And all of this is very interesting, and all of this is potentially very interesting. And we have a very, very diverse panel here today because we have two people who are biographers, one person who has really pioneered work in music and psychology, one person who, apart from being the president of an international music education society, is also working very closely with children and music, and of course a composer, not to mention a performer. So I said we actually have the song, the singer, the writer about the song, the person who analyzes the song, and perhaps how to sing as well. So for a music education seminar, this would have made a fantastic panel. We shall try to be as literary as possible. Maybe we can sing, as Rob says. I actually posed the first question to Vikram and to Lakshmi. And this is actually talking about writing about music, specifically about biographies. One One of the alarming lacks we find in India especially is the lack of archiving. I know, Vikram, this is very close to your heart, of music from the past and good biographies from the past of musicians. Part of the problem being it's very difficult to find material, part of the problem being it's very difficult to write about it. And where we find biographies, they become hagiographies. It's very difficult to find a balanced perspective. What do you feel about it? If you could start with Vikram, from your own experience, and what do you think would be the ways forward?
You've said it all, Anil, actually. So, especially, I think in India, the problem with documenting music has been, stems from the fact that it has been an oral tradition. It's almost considered, it was almost considered blasphemous to have it notated, written down. And when everything was transmitted word of mouth from teacher to taught, even stories about musicians went on from generation to generation, often lost in translation, lot of exaggeration. So whatever musical history that exists, and I'm talking from the Indian context, has largely been anecdotal memories. And I think that is where the problem lies, where every person has a story of his own about a musician. And usually the biographies have been written either by the children of the musicians or their students. And so an objective assessment of their life, their flaws, their plus points has seldom come to the fore. And it's usually eulogizing them as probably the best gifts of God to mankind, which is okay in a way. But then I think this objectivity that is there, which is very essential in a biography, that is missing. A biography, from my personal experience, it's a very, very consuming affair. And I think it starts off as a love affair. You get affected by an individual, an idea, and you have to invest so much of your emotion, your time, your effort in researching it. It's usually 5 to 6 years of involvement with the subject. And at the end of it, the requirement on the part of the biographer is he or she needs to cut off the emotional cord. You suddenly need to step back as a neutral observer, and then in the course of these long years, every friend and enemy of your subject has become your friend and enemy. You are more privy to their personal matters than probably they were aware of it themselves. You have looked at their life through so many aspects, and there is that emotional affectation. But to suddenly cut it all off and become very neutral, to prevent it from what you said is a hagiography, I think that is very difficult. And the genre is now picking up in India of biographies on musicians. And as you said, archival material is also sparse. You have recordings perhaps of musicians, and I'm battling that in my initiative of the Archive of Indian Music, where we are digitizing very old gramophone records of the country, starting 1900 to 1940. The recordings are available, but even the person who's selling those records seldom knows who the musician is whose recording it is. So in which case, compiling a full-length biography becomes almost an impossible task. So I think these are some of the issues which I think are what face biography writing in music in India.
Lakshmi, you wrote this incredible biography about Lalgudi Jayaraman. And I'm sure you faced many of the issues that Vikram faced, except in your case, I do know that in Vikram's case, Gauhar Jan was a lady who captured his heart but was long dead and gone. I remember Vikram specifically making the point that people were very worried that he was in love with somebody who's dead and gone and were wondering if he was mentally okay. But in Lakshmi's case, I know that Lalgudi Jayaraman sir is somebody who has been part of your life in multiple ways. And the objectivity would have been even harder for you to write. And yet, I know from personal experience reading your book that it was extremely balanced. How did you approach it?
Thank you so much, Anil, for the compliments. I think you have neatly summed it up. Okay. I grew up on Lalgudi's music. My daughter learned from him. That made it even more difficult because of the guru angle coming in. But as notwithstanding all this, I think a biographer should be honest with his or her job, what she has taken up, or what has been commissioned to him or her. And once that commitment is made to honesty, I think everything else falls in place. So, right from the beginning, when I started work, in fact, Mr. Jayaraman himself has written in his foreword that I cross-checked every bit of information that he gave. I don't think he was particularly right. I don't think I was cross-checking him. I was just doing my duty as a biographer to make sure that everything I put in was cross-referenced, which was my duty as a biographer. So I just, while I continue to be very fond of his music, like I said, much influenced by it even in my adolescent years. But nothing of this, I think, a certain amount of distance, like Vikram just pointed out, we got to be consciously aware not to intertwine ourselves so inextricably with our subject, and that we are here to do a job and to keep everything else at bay.
And yet, let's say from the audience perspective and from me, there must be at least 2,000-3,000 Carnatic musicians of repute that we ourselves would have personally experienced in our lifetime in one form or the other. Either we've seen the name or heard the music or heard of it in the last, let's say, 40 years. And how many authorized biographies are there? Totally 4 or 5, a handful, of which 80% of the biographies written about Carnatic musicians are written by these two people. So I think while that sounds amusing, I think it's also an alarming lack of the ability to bring objectivity and being able to capture the life of great musicians. But this has not technically been the experience in the West. And I'm sort of moving to this part of the panel. I'm going to specifically move to Rob, who is, I know, an extraordinary composer, among other things. One of the things we've discussed is the ability to make literature and music come together in sort of this very intertwined way, which could be one way forward of making the written word more accessible using the language of music. I mean, it's a very, very interesting concept to understand. Lakshmi's book, for example, worked, I think, because the CD that accompanied everything, Vikram's book with the CD that accompanied every single anecdote that you gave, made such an indelible impression on people who read it. But I think you've taken it one step forward. Rob's done something extraordinary. I think let's hear that first and then have a little bit of a chat about that. If we can have the audio, he's brought something that he's done.
Just before we play it. So what we're about to hear is the poet E. Cummings reading one of his own poems, Sweet Spring. And I took that recording of him speaking and played it live along with musical accompaniment, which gives the effect of, it sounds like he's singing because of the way it's framed. So this is called Sweet Spring.
Sweet spring is your time, is my time, is our time. For springtime is love time, and viva sweet love. All the merry little birds are flying in the floating in the very spirit, singing in the winging in the blossoming. Lovers go and lovers come, a wandering, but any two are perfectly alone. There's nobody else alive. Such a sky and such a sun I never knew, and neither did you. And everybody never breathed quite so many kinds of yes. Not a tree can count his leaves, each herself mine, but shining who by thousands mean only one amazing thing. Secretly adoring, shyly, tiny winging, darting, floating, merry in the blossoming, always joyful selves are singing. Sweet spring is your time, is my time, is our time, for springtime is love time, and viva sweet love.
Thank you. I think that was fascinating. For those of you who didn't hear his introduction, what's happened is that he's taken the tonality, the timbre of his voice and made music alongside. It actually makes it come alive in an extraordinarily, unimaginably beautiful way. And I don't know if, especially given that most Indian musicians, even in the way they spoke, were very musical, this is probably an idea for us to take to make biographies come alive, actually. I can actually already visualize some of our singers, and if you actually made a biography of them, how would it sound? It's sort of like your My Name is Gauhar Jan kind of thing. But Rob, tell us something about why you chose to do this and what sort of inspired you to do this kind of work.
Well, I think I just always was finding myself distracted by the music in the way people speak. And I'm not the only person to do this, is to make music out of language. I was always very fascinated when I was growing up about how language and music seemed very close. And I think that singing does connect very closely with language. So it's really just a way of showing the music that's happening all around us all the time. I think that we're all composers, actually, because we're creating new sentences all the time. We're also creating new melodies in our speech. And if you just change your perception a bit around that, then you find there's an amazing amount of melody around us all the time. And it's really trying to show how I sometimes hear the world. And it helps me to have a deeper experience of the poetry myself, yeah.
I think this is... Virgil Thompson was a great music critic. And the thing he says, and I'm quoting from his, he says, play me your music and I will write what I want the rest of the world to hear. And I think you managed to do that. And I just wanted you to shed some light on how this will actually help in cross-cultural musical narrative as well.
Well, Margaret here was just saying she was listening to the Hindi talk just before us in the other tent, and not being able to understand the actual meaning of the words. She was listening to that as music. And I think that when you listen to the music behind words, you actually can get to the emotions which are behind the words. Oliver Sacks wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which you may know, and he gives a report about a group of aphasics or aphasiacs. What's the word, right? Aphasiacs. People who lack the ability to understand the meanings of words, but they can still understand the spoken intonation, the melody of speech. And they can actually often hear when somebody's lying more than somebody who understands words. So there was a group of aphasiacs who were listening to President Reagan, this is back in the 1980s, giving a speech, and they were all laughing. And that's because Oliver Sacks said because they could tell that there was an incongruity with what he was really saying and what he was trying to put across. They could tell he was lying. So they say that you cannot lie to an aphasiac because they don't get distracted by the surface of the word's meanings. So, in other words, music can bypass the things which we put in as barriers between ourselves and lead us towards empathy. And there's a lot of research which demonstrates that there's lots of ways that music can actually increase empathy. So in terms of cross-cultural understanding, there's a lot of suggestion from that if we can relate to each other through music, then we may be able to connect through empathy as well. This, of course, is a complex thing because what we mean by music varies a lot from culture to culture and we have different emphases. But I myself have certainly experienced some of that through exploring music here in India.
I'm going to go back to Vikram and Lakshmi for a really quick one before I go to Margaret. So there's a very important insight here on using music itself to create empathy to make the story come alive. I mean, we saw a demonstration of that. Vikram, you especially, because you've gone through the material in Germany and all that, and the way they described Indian music when they first came across it. What did that tell you about the way people read the literature about music coming from this part of the world. And even now, I think it's not, I don't think, have things changed?
I don't think so. I think there is still a wide chasm that exists between the East and the West. There is a lot of exoticism with which I think the East is seen, but I don't know if it is, if that translates into an understanding, or even sometimes, if I may say, an attempt to understand.
He said empathy. Is that there?
Yeah. So that I think, because during my research on Gauhar Jan, there was the gramophone company that came to India to record in 1902. And you had these German agents who were coming to India, looking at the music completely from a commercial perspective, never with a sense of empathy, never trying to understand what the music was, but what sold and what did not. And some of the diaries of those experts very explicitly say that, this is appalling music. I have to forget all my memories of Western opera houses. There's no concept of harmony in Indian music. These drums that keep beating are so offensive to the ear, and the way the musicians dress up, the pan they eat, their beetle nut stained teeth, it's all so offensive. So there's always there was always that sort of an approach to
Tarakini and Madhu are laughing because it's offensive to them as well, by the way.
Well, so I think that was the vision of India pre-independence. After the 1950s and 60s, especially perhaps with the going of musicians like Pandit Ravi Shankar and Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, Vilayat Khan, Balachandar, M.S. Lakshmi and others to the West. From this total disdain, I think the next stage was fascination, and then a little window of trying to explore, and a few cross-cultural, interactions did happen. But I think a lot more could and must emerge, and this is something we've also been discussing for a long time as part of the ISME, the International Society of Music Education, initiatives which we are trying to now have in India through all these wonderful speakers here, where I think, given the complexity of the music here, the amount of opportunities that poses to a world music collaboration, I think that's something that can grow for the future.
Lakshmi, do you agree that there is a distinct chasm between the East and West in terms of understanding cultural context and therefore literature and music?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this from a different perspective. I think any new information that we are exposed to, we judge it on the basis of what we already have in our heads. And it is from that standpoint that we judge. So I think that should not be there. We should have an openness and receive things with an open mind. Then we can see, we'll have an unbiased, and we'll be able to appreciate the beauty of what is being presented. And the, as is. That will help in this cross-cultural exchanges. Not judging a piece of Western music from a Carnatic viewpoint or vice versa, or this disdain. Everything else will disappear if we just empty our heads and listen to it with an open mind.
We're talking about emptying our heads, which leads me naturally, therefore, to Dr. Graham Welch, who I share a great affinity with, who's done extensive work on actually how the head responds to music. So I think it's a very logical place to ask you about conditioning and context. And you have the psychological basis, you've studied that. And why is it that this empathy, why is it so difficult for this empathy to occur?
Well, I think we can pick up the themes that already have emerged in this discussion. First of all, communication always involves translation, whether this is music or whether this is words, whatever the sources are. So in terms of human communication, everything is subjective. Objectivity doesn't exist. So what we are working on, all of us, is trying to understand, is there a shared subjectivity? People at the moment are not listening to my exact English, God forbid. They are trying to extract meaning from what I'm saying, because the brain is a pattern detecting mechanism. It is designed to make sense of the world. It cannot stand chaos. And its initial reaction to something new in a sonic form to do with sound, whether it's music or language, is that we pay attention to those sonic features. We pay attention to rhythm, to melody. These are the things that we notice when we start hearing another language, which is not our own. And that language may be a musical language, or it may be a language in a more conventional sense. So the brain has to make sense of that. And the initial engagement in that kind of communication, as Rob says, is profoundly emotional. So the challenge is whether we're trying to engage someone in a biography and ourselves in a biography, or with a new piece of music, is to understand that it will be emotional. And how can we enable our audience, whether these are music listeners or whether these are readers, to understand that that emotional initial engagement, we hope, will be positive. It may be disturbing, but we hope that it will be positive. The language, the spoken language, and the musical languages, they share common roots and they have common features in the way that they are processed in the brain. And we're just beginning to understand this more, of how important prosody, about how important rhythm is, the way that sound gets segmented into words or into music. And one of the things that Margaret will be sharing is the wonderful world of how young children begin to engage. And for them, these two things don't exist separately. They are a holistic experience for children, where words and music and language are one thing. And as adults, we artificially disentangle them unless we have a clever adult who decides to interfere with our processing and put it back again.
Right, and we have one very clever gent, if I may say so. With Margaret, it's over to you in a way. So we are facing two situations here. One is a sort of a lack of a cross-cultural empathy that we spoke about. And the second, which I am far more concerned about, I know Vikram's concerned about, and everybody in this panel is concerned about, is how to get the young to start reading about music, how to get the young to engage with music in ways which are more than just entertainment or just listening to it, how to get them to actually engage with it far more substantively, and you've got the experience in both aspects.
Okay. Let me make a few remarks before launching into some of the questions that you have raised. One is that when we are talking about music, are we talking about the thing that we hear or about the experience that we have as we engage with the music? You know, this year marks a celebration of the work of John Dewey, who wrote in 1934 the text Art as Experience. And one of his key points was that in our experience of art, the aesthetic does not actually sit in the thing itself. It's not in that canvas on a wall. It's actually in the engagement, the interaction, the subjective engagement that we have with it. That's where the art is, in this ephemeral space that is between our flesh and blood and this object or event. Which brings me to thinking about ideas of subjectivity and objectivity. As Graham has said, objectivity within a social world, a cultural world, is impossible. You know, I come from a research world where there's lots of emphasis on objectivity, but I also work in a research tradition that recognises that bias exists, and one of the ways of understanding bias is not to try and delete it, not to try and design it out of research and our thinking, but instead to recognise it, to announce it, and to put it, and I would suggest in some of the autobiographical or biographical writing, to put in a reflexive manner those biases out for the reader, so the reader can understand the lens that we come to that work with, and is able to make their own decisions rather than accepting in a singular way whatever it is that is written. To pick up on a comment from Rob, he said that young children are all composers. I heartily agree. I have worked with, in a project I'm working on at the moment with Graham, we're currently working with children aged 6 months of age, and we are following them through the first 3 years of their lives. What we are capturing are their musical engagements with their parents and caregivers and siblings. And right from the very beginning, even in what would ostensibly be called talk, is actually musical. When you think about how a parent or a caregiver engages with a young child, it is full of melody. We don't say to a 6-month-old, "Hello, how are you today?" Instead, we say, "Hello, hello, how are you today?" Or we are making music. And it's through that engagement with the young children that they learn of the melodies and rhythms that are implicit in spoken language. And we've discovered that young children invent their own song making, and it's a very rich form of creative music engagement that every child starts out doing. Our big problem is they reach school and we tell them that that's not really song and not really singing, and to stop that.
So at the moment we've done sort of a round robin. We started with talking about biography and the sort of paucity of available material and the paucity of objectivity in being able to write about it. We moved from there to trying to understand how to actually make the written word about music come alive. And I thought that the illustration from E. Cummings that he's done is fabulous because even a non-musical person would be able to pick up on that. And we've sort of gone through both the psychological underpinnings of why a lack of empathy might occur and your views on children and sort of looking at specific customized ways of actually reaching out to them, which is very different from writing for adults, which is where we are. Lakshmi, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the effort you've taken up to make biographies come alive for children. If you can just talk for a couple of minutes on that. And I think we have some young people, so we might want to give them away as well.
I have one of my books here. It's my effort at taking such worthy stories to the younger generation in a form that would appeal to them. It's my job as a writer to make things interesting for the reader. I have no business in dumping a boring book on them. And I think so I think the pictorial format is a very deliberate choice that I made because it appeals to all age groups. I don't think there is a non-musical person in the world. I don't think there is
apparently that is not true. There is actually a psychological condition called amusia, which is
it so?
Which I think Dr. Welch will be able to explain much better. But there actually are people who do not respond to music physically.
Who don't like music is what I was
I don't know, but if they don't hear it.
Now talking about response. And so I think, like I said, everyone likes a touch of art in their lives. And so I decided to tell these stories using this graphic biography format. So half the story is told through pictures and the other half through the written word.
So it's sort of, as you were joking, it's sort of Mozart goes anime or Mozart goes Comic-Con, which would actually make it pretty cool for a lot of young people to read.
And the entry, if I can just add one more sentence, the entry into being a lover of music, I think can also happen through the written word.
Right.
You read a book like this as just a storybook, and somewhere something touches you and you want to listen to the music of the lady, and then that draws you into music.
So here's sort of like a very broad 101 question, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer this because this is coming out of what Lakshmi just said. How does literature help in the appreciation of music? It's a very, very broad question, right? Because there are a lot of musicians sitting there wondering why we're talking about music instead of just going to the concert in the evening, right? Why are we talking about writing about music? Why is this, how does this even help? Can it be a pathway or vice versa?
Yes, I think part of the problem also lies with the musicians themselves, if I may say so. There's this famous, quote that is attributed to Veena Dhanammal, when the famous Veena player from Chennai, when the Madras Music Academy was established, for a long time she shunned going there because she looked down upon it. That is a place where they talk music. What is there to talk about music? Because there were lecture demonstrations being given. Music is only to be played. And I think the whole rigor and the pressures of performance ensures that they don't keep a logbook of their own. They don't maintain their own diaries. Very few memoirs and autobiographies are perhaps written. And so the literature that exists there, as I said at the start, it's all word of mouth, anecdotal passing on. But when we, I think, talk about literature related to music, it's probably a wider array. So at least, again, from the Indian context, you have musicological texts, which also have its place in the entire pantheon of music literature, which we have not probably touched upon, which appeals to a very niche segment, people who are talking about how the Gandhara is oscillating between two swaras and so on, which may not appeal to a large section of people at large. Then the other could be biographies, which we've covered. And increasingly, there are books which are being written about problems facing the music world, what are the ways ahead. So these, I think, in my view, are the three broad areas on which literature exists. And what is it that you want out of this? And a performing art, and as I'm sure as documenters of that, the problem is like it's capturing a bird in motion. Right. When you can't show to the reader, to the audience, the flapping of the wings. You can't, and the minute you do that, it is not a capture in time. At the same time, it is just a moment in space which we are capturing in the book. So I think that becomes a huge problem for any writing on music, and that's what I...
Having said that, I remember you and me discussing The Music Room by Namita Devi Dayal, for example, which I remember both of us discussing this quite at length, and how much it prompted both of us and other people who to actually go and research the work of Kesarbai and Dondatai Kulkarni and so on, because it was actually the written word inspiring you to go in search of music. But we have precious few books like that. I mean, it's really, really quite a scarcity. Would you agree, Lakshmi?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is not just the written word. I would say it's the spoken word, a personal experience of mine when I attended a conference on music. And there was this great scholar talking about this text, 12th century text called Sangeeta Ratnakara by Sarangadeva. By Sarangadeva. And I was so fascinated by the way she spoke and the contents that she really revealed that I actually I was very, very young at the time. And I went and picked up a book from the bookshop to find that it just went over my head. And, and that is when I decided to I said, why not? These are I see a story in every bit of information. So information need not be divested from story. Everything is a story, right from a filament in a bulb. So I said, why can't we say this as stories, as a way of transmitting this? And which is when I started writing. You were talking about musicological texts and everything. These are the chapters that you have on your lap, and which I wrote as stories for young children in a very entertaining format. And they are all 13th, 14th century texts that I have talked about in a very breezy format. In fact, one musicologist actually asked me, why do you want to say all this for young children? And my retort truly is, why not?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you want me to offer a comment? I think that writing in music or writing about music both celebrate the human condition. We need those. Part of the interest that I share with Margaret is how do we enable children, young people, but people of any age to understand the value And in order to understand the value of writing in music and writing about music, you have to make music. You deal with the sound before you deal with the symbol, whether the notation is musical and its wonderful ambiguity, or with its apparent objectivity but equal ambiguity in the written word. And it's that ambiguity between people that both music and language have, which are fundamental to the human condition and to this kind of festival. It's a celebration of what it is to be human, and we shouldn't deny that in the way that we talk about it, the way we engage with it. We need all of these different kinds of knowledge to come together in this kind of holistic mosaic of what's important. One very quick comment about amusia. The number of people that have something wrong with their brain, literally, who are not able to process or make sense of music, is so small, you're unlikely to meet one in your lifetime.
Indeed.
Margaret, your comments on this, on the Literature and Music Coalition, and also being you, from both a both from a cross-cultural as well as a young people's perspective.
Okay, which is also a psychological perspective, yes, but probably more a cultural psychological perspective. I think writing about music is very, very important. Music is, there is no musical object. It is a heard thing. And although music has been objectified, there is nothing that we can hold on to. The CD is not the music. It's just a sort of a chemical composition that's managed to capture some aspects of the music. So we need a way to, in a world that has become increasingly focused on the visual over the oral, to find ways of using the visual to help us understand the oral. And so the written word, the spoken word, the written word is one way of taking our attention back to the quality of music and its sounds itself. Within that, I would also suggest that we can often use words, using metaphors and alliterations and so on, to capture the essence of a musical experience. And I'm not talking about whether it's a dominant seventh followed by a minor whatever, but what a musical experience actually does to us and for us. And I'm going to tell a very, very brief anecdote from my very early days of teaching. I was teaching in a school in Tasmania, and I was working with a class of 5-year-olds. And I played them a piece of contemporary vocal music, which had been written by a Swedish composer, Arne Melnius. And it's a piece of music for children's choir. It doesn't have a very clear melody. It uses all sorts of speech sounds. So you will hear the choir making sounds, all sorts of crazy sounds, and they're really, really interesting. Well, I was a very inexperienced teacher, and of course these 5-year-olds rolled around on the floor laughing, and I was worried about what on earth their reaction to this piece of music was. And I was completely stunned at the end of it when they said, "Could you play it for us again?" And what I need to tell you is that the piece is actually about a troll saga, a Swedish troll saga. And it ends with a chant of nonsense words where the music has risen to a huge crescendo. It's a broad range of pitch. It's incredibly loud. And then sudden silence, followed by a chant and an exhaled breath from the whole choir. I will never forget, a young child looked at me and said, "I loved it when the heart fell out of the music." And it was that moment when we've gone from massive crescendos to quiet. And there is a wonderful example of how words about music can capture an essence that I couldn't think of a better way of putting it. And that might be one of the ways in which we can address cross-cultural issues, by drawing on metaphor that we use in all of our languages so powerfully as a means of understanding, not necessarily letting music writing be hijacked by the theorist, but also letting the poets in there as well to help us understand the experience of music.
Thank you. Rob, closing thoughts from you. And I think for the benefit of some of the people who came later, we might want to play the clip again as a sort of ending piece.
Well, of course, India has a long tradition of metaphor with music, with some of the wonderful paintings and stories and myths about ragas, which is often how I try to introduce some of my students in Australia to hearing a raga, and they find that very helpful, even though it might be quite sort of esoteric in some ways. But also telling stories is a fantastic way to want you, like you were saying, to drive you back to want to listen to the music. So when I teach music, I'm just telling stories all the time as a way to get students to want to be engaged with the music. And in terms of Indian music, so just telling the stories of Hariprasad Chaurasia with his background in wrestling, or Yesu Das having to struggle with different religious conflicts and going into the temple as a Christian and all these things. And people find that very engaging, and then they want to find out about the person. So there's a very successful book from New York by Alex Ross called The Rest is Noise, which deals with 20th century contemporary art music from the West. And it does it continuously with stories, and it's actually very successful in getting people to really have a great desire to listen to music which normally they are highly resistant to. And that's opened up some very challenging music to a wide range of people, because it's telling stories of how people experienced music throughout the 20th century, including at very important moments, such as with the Nazis and with Stalin in Russia, and how he was trying to control particular compositions and how people listened to music. And all of that is so enriching, I think. So I think what you're doing is very, very useful in terms of promoting an engagement with music. What was the other question? We're going to play my piece again. This is E. Cummings saying his poem Sweet Spring with musical accompaniment to sort of bring out the musical aspects of this poetry. Of course, poetry is already quite musical, but this is trying to really help you to listen to poetry very much as music.
As he's setting up, Vikram, may I request you to give the audience the anecdote that you shared at the beginning of the music education seminar, where every art form is connected to each other. I think I was going to quote Virgil Thompson, but I think your quote will be far better.
Well, there was this, I think it's a 5th century text in Sanskrit called the Vishnu Dharmottara, where the sage Markandeya, he's approached by a king, Vajra, who asks him to teach him the art of sculpture. And the sage says to learn how to be able to sculpt, that you have to learn the art of painting. And when the king then says, okay, then teach me painting, he then says, to learn painting, you have to learn dance, because unless you know how the form and shape and so on, the movement, you cannot paint. And then he says, okay, I'll learn dance. And then when he agrees to do that, he says, but to understand dance, you need to know music. To which by then I think the king is exasperated. He says, okay, I'll learn music. To which he says, but you can't understand music unless you know the form and structure which is inherent in sculpture. So you've actually come back full circle. And I don't think the idea of the sage was to fob off the king or to kind of confuse him. But the fact that all the arts are so interrelated, and it is almost impossible for us, we put them all in silos like we do of physics and chemistry and biology and all that. But then here, there's so much of an interplay between the arts. Like we were hearing Dr. Maya Rao's clip in the afternoon, where she says a choreography is a combination of so many things. It's dance, it's music, it's also theater, it's a lot of other things, stage management, color, lighting. So I think that is something that especially in our completely formalized education setup, we've put music also into these silos, and that is what perhaps keeps it away from a lot of people.
So on that note, we're going to hear the music, and for the benefit of the audience, so if when you hear the poetry by E. E. Cummings, you will notice that what Rob has done is taken the structure of language as the basis to construct the structure of the music. And when you put the words and the music together, the heart and the mind will dance. So we will hear that clip right now.
So many kinds of yes. Not a tree can count his leaves, each herself my opening, but shining who by thousands mean only one amazing thing. Secretly adoring, shyly, tiny winging, darting, floating, merry in the blossoming, always joyful selves are singing. Sweet spring, is your time, is my time, is our time, for springtime is love time, and viva sweet love.
That was actually the original voice of E. E. Cummings. Obviously, my mic won't function after that. We are done with our discussion. We'd love to have some questions from the audience to any of our speakers. An apology on behalf of Dr. Margaret Barrett. She has to catch a flight today, and given the situation in Tamil Nadu, and Bangalore especially, on the way to the airport, she's had to leave a little earlier because this session got a little postponed. But any questions for any of our wonderful speakers today?
I
Yes,
just
sir.
wanted to make a comment, audacious enough to say that we Indians have music and dance in our genes. It's just waiting to be explored and trained, I guess.
Absolutely. A question here in the front row.
Hi, my question is about the appreciation of music in general, right? So we talk about the notes and notation, how do we understand music, etc. So if you take the Western classical style, there are plenty of body of work that encourages you to learn classical music. For instance, if you take the classics explained by Jeremy Seepman, he takes Brandenburg 4 and 5, rips it apart to melody, motifs, and he explains every single moment. When I go to Chennai during the season and listen to Simendra Madhyamam being explained for 8 minutes, I get lost. And if there are any work, you have written books on music. So, I would like to understand if there are any body of work that helps me understand and appreciate Indian music the way I see the equivalent in Western. I'm a student of Western classical, so I go searching for such things. But when I try to do it, I see a book here or there talking about the history. I know the history of MS and I know the history of Swati Tirunal and everybody, but to appreciate their music, 8 minutes of Sinmendra Madhyamam completely confuses me because there is nobody to explain me, right? So what is steps being taken by folks like you or anybody who is into the field of music and who are interested in promoting appreciation of music on that front?
Work to explain Manodharma, for example. There's no body of work to explain, for example, if Vikram were to render Simendra Madhyamam and I were to render Simendra Madhyamam, are going to be extremely different ideas of imagination and inventiveness. And it's a combination of rasa, and it's a combination of our own imagination and experience feeding into the rendition of that. And that's such a hard thing to be able to write down, and it's inherently built into the structure of our music itself. When I have raised this question myself, in why don't, for example, if I take Symphony number 40, I can go through it bar by bar by bar, and I know exactly what's happening in each bar. But inherent to that is the structure of our music, number one. And the second thing is that it being such an individualized, stylized thing, the maximum you can get is an approximation of the idea behind the imagination of the rendition.
Fair, sir.
So it's very difficult to put that down. But having said that, there is a big body of work now being built up. There's a lot of people who are trying to write about music, not just the two people on stage, but a lot of people trying to write about music, about dance, in ways which help a listener at least approach the music with some amount of wisdom.
Exactly.
And I'll share that with you. There are a few websites as well which note those things.
Because
it's definitely very, very, very much below what's available in the West. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So my question was only that, right? So even if you take conductors, right? I mean, the way Gantharvan does it versus say Zubin Mehta does it, the same piece. When they interpret, right? It's not about a generic way of explaining the piece itself. It's about how they have interpreted it, and this is what they have been trying. And so when Vikram does it or you does it, and if there is a commentary on that by somebody who knows music and knows their stuff, it'll help us to, oh, this is how he interpreted it, and this is how this gentleman has done it. So
it's, as I said, the problem is both musical. It's not musical. The problem is sociological.
Precisely.
And it's a complex problem. But I think future generations, and now I think the process has started thanks to people like him and Lakshmi. I think the process has begun. So let's have this conversation 10 years from now. Hopefully we'll be in a better situation is all I can say.
Sure. Thank you very much.
As usual, our children will have it better than us. And that's the hope.
This is not a question, but maybe a suggestion. I think there's a lot of conversations which have started on this topic. We just finished one in Surogi. And people ask the same question about, where do you go and find some literature? And suggestion more, Vikram, to you, because, we've been seeing that you're at the center of a lot of, such conversations which are happening or events which are taking place, where there was a recent one last week, which was on working days from morning till evening. And, I'm sure people who are, in the corporate world can't attend that. Maybe if all these, the conversation which just happened, if we could find a way to make them into available as a, writing in some form, maybe that would start another chapter. Maybe some things, which you're probably getting from AIM, all those initiatives, all the conversations, why don't we just get them into print?
More than print, I think all the sessions are being recorded, and it's being streamed live. Second, it's also going to be uploaded on YouTube. I think that is the archive of the future, much more than the written word. So you can see us all talk if the YouTube still remains 50 years from now, even if we are gone.
Including the one that happened?
Yes.
It's going to be there?
Yes.
In fact, sir, I would give you a suggestion as well, is I think, and for whoever can, blog about these things. I think the technology has made so much of archiving possible at our fingertips. We don't even have to wait for a centralized blog to happen. I think this discourse that we are having, in your own experience, even for you, your own experiences of listening to a Simendra Madhyamam or whatever it may be, if you start putting it into your blog, you're going to become the reference material for somebody else, and we will, in an interactive way, we'll start building towards that literature. Especially in our country, we have this habit of looking towards our heroes to give us all solutions. I think each one of us is a hero, and we need to start creating these dialogues and these conversations is a suggestion I'd like to make. Madhu, did you have a question? Or?
I've just got a question.
Sorry.
Yeah. mean, in fact, Anil sir, I recently had a chance to attend one of your programs in Infosys, and that was a great evening. In fact, thank you so much for coming there. And my question is, probably, see, I'm not from a music background or anything. I'm a layman. I'm just trying to understand the greatness of music. Probably, if I need to share something to my kid, what are some tips that we should follow?
I'll give you the two-bit answer right away, but we'll have a more detailed conversation off stage, because that's really not the scope of the discussion. But can I have your MS Lakshmi? Have you seen this? Yeah, I think a lot of these help children tremendously. You know, it's actually very interesting even for us. I learned so much by just going through this, which I didn't know. Many of them come with accompanying CDs and so on. There's now Western music. There is this whole series called Baby Mozart, Baby Chopin, Baby Beethoven, and so on, which are all commercially available. There's an entire literature on music appreciation for children that's now commercially and physically available. There is also a lot of information. If you just go to Amazon or if you go to any of the commercial websites and you start looking up, there's actually music appreciation for children using Indian music also, which is now being uploaded. Many of us are part of these initiatives as well. There's quite a lot of resources available, and we continue to build them. My suggestion at this point, how old is your child? 5, is to expose the child orally as much as possible. The oral pathways have to open up first, is to be able to listen to, and probably not a 40-minute delineation of Simendra Madhyamam to start with, but perhaps a Notuswaram. There are certain ways of doing that. So we'll talk about that for sure.
Another very big thing is to just sing with your child, no matter if you can sing or not. That's one of the most important things. Isn't that right, Graham?
I had a response. How do you get young people interested in music? How do you bring them to music? And I think, because I've worked a lot with children over the last 25 years, I think one of the important things is to listen to children. You know, we keep trying to get them to do our kind of thing, and we don't want to listen to what they have to offer. So starting from what Margaret was talking about, you know, the music that a 6-month-old baby makes, to actually listening to them all along. You know, what is their interest? What is fascinating them? I think that's very important.
I think that's very valuable, actually. It's very valuable, and thank you for that.
I could offer a comment, is that music is fundamental to our identity, and it's fundamental to the child's identity. And one of the ways that we can engage them successfully, as what Jerome Bruner, a wonderful American psychologist, he talked about people like us, adults, as senior learners. Yeah? People who know a little bit more, but who have to be open still to learning. And if we can celebrate what children, young people, other adults around us bring to a learning situation, we are then able to support their musical identity, their self-esteem, their self-efficacy, their view of how well they can do something. And we can use that to transform both them and ourselves. That's critical.
Thank you so much, Graham.
Just add one thing. For youngsters, young minds, as part of their growing up process, I think a song and a story should be made part of their everyday lives.
Absolutely. And on the story of that wonderful comment, we end this session. Thank you so much for being an appreciative audience. And thank you, wonderful speakers, Vikram Sampath, Lakshmi Devnath, Graham Welch, Margaret Barrett, and Robert Davidson. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, panelists. That was a wonderful session indeed. I would now request the panelists to sign the BLF wall. Those who wish to get their books signed, kindly head to the signing area. Thank you.